This is the introduction to our Book of Romans series. To answer your question now, Romans is Paul's most complete thought. And I think that it sits as the prize of his theology. It's his magnum opus. It's the full, and it's not everything. I think, as I was looking around, I was realizing, there's some. He mentions other issues. There's other things that are dealt with topically that he writes in other letters, and that's fine. It's not meant to, like, if I were to sit down and write a systematic theology, I wouldn't include every doctrine I've ever talked about. I would probably focus on the major things. And as we examine what Paul was doing and why he was doing it, it'll be clear why he wrote what he did. But I would say that if you had to reduce the New Testament to two books,
be in the picture.
I would take Romans, and I would take and the Gospel of John. And I think in terms of us Gentiles, if you read nothing else other than John and Romans, you get the presentation of the life of the gospel, and not in perfect form, because I think the other gospels fill in some of the historic contextual details. But I think in the same way, Romans, you get the most essential, the most salient points of Paul's theology, and then in some of the other letters. And here's the thing, and I go back, and I've said this before, I wrestle with some of the epistles. Not that I don't think they were holy, not that I don't think they were inspired, not that I don't think that what Paul was writing was a reflection of God's work in him, but just because Paul wrote something doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be canonized. And our method of saying this is the Bible and the authority we stamp on that is very different than when in the 4th century they said this is the canon, because they basically were selecting they took all of the holy writings. But keep in mind, it wasn't until like 382, the Council of Rome, that they actually canonized. I can hear you, Chris and Linda, by the way.
Sorry, I thought it was muted. Apologize.
Good thing you didn't say anything bad. Like, man, this guy's a jerk. No, now I can't see you either. You didn't have to
Ran them off.
Yeah, see, now the video's back on. They're the same problem. They're like, either you get both video and audio, or you get nothing. But all that's to say, as we talk about how this book comes about, you'll see the importance and the significance of all of this together. But at the end of the day, Romans is probably the most agreed upon writing of Paul. That Paul wrote it, that it represents Paul's theology accurately, and that it should be considered a part of the scriptures. So in terms of canonicity, I don't think you get a stronger book beyond the Gospels. The Gospels sort of set out on the Gospels sort of mirror the Torah, or the Pentateuch, the first 5 books. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and those were given to Moses for the Jews in the same way the Gospels were given to us. And even that, the Gospels present challenges because there's all discrepancies and things that we run into. And feel free to interrupt. I'm just going to sort of to riff here for a little bit while, and I'm going to talk about. So what we're going to do is we're going to do some introductory stuff. I'm going to talk about all of the sort of basic categories that we would of any book: authorship, date, time, context, that sort of thing. I want to highlight the form and talk about the form of the whole book. I want to hit on some theological norms, and then I'm going to just go through briefly the argument. It may not take us the whole hour and a half. I know sometimes I've pushed that over the years, just kind of like church, used to stop at 11. Now I push to 11:15. I always usually push this to the end, but you almost spit. You're going to spit towards Alan, not me.
I swallowed.
Okay, so Romans is the 6th book of the New Testament, and what you should realize and remember is that those are not in chronological order. They put the Gospels up front, and like my my local clergy brother Ed Nettleton, he always said that he thought it should go John, Matthew, Mark, Luke, because John is the presentation of to the Gentiles the gospel. Except it's upstairs. And then Luke bleeds, as we were talking about earlier, Luke is one continuous book right into the Acts of the Apostles. After you get this sort of 4-book series of what the story of Jesus was, then you have the beginning of the church, and then you have Romans. Now keep in mind, After you get past Acts, which is kind of a little bit of the history of what was going on in the early church, after that, the dating is completely out the window. So you get four accounts of Jesus following the only chronology that actually is represented there, really in some sense, because it goes in the gospel and then it bleeds into Pentecost, into the life of the New Testament church. And then you put a break in. And then you have Paul's epistles. And you got some other epistles towards the end, John and Jude. But they are ordered not in chronological order, but in order of size. That's it. That's the criteria. They're like, hey, Roman's the biggest. Let's shove it up front. Now, saying that, it's oftentimes, and I think this is true about education, you learn the big pieces and then you fill in the details later. It's kind of like if you look at church history, I talk about church history in four epochs, or everyone talks about church history. And you have early church, you have medieval church, you have Reformation church, you have contemporary church, and they all sort of flow. And once you have these categories of the church, then you start to put details in. And so Romans really is meant to do that. So this is sort of the big hooks upon which the church hangs its theology. And it has guided both Roman Catholic and Protestant theology, but it also, the notion of freedom that we're going to talk about and faith by grace alone comes out in Romans in a way that it doesn't come, I mean, it comes out in Romans in a way that is probably new for some, sort of a revised, because up to that point it was a works mentality. And this is when you get into the sort of 12th century through up to the Reformation and the development of indulgences. Yes, Rome wasn't built in a day; it was built over several centuries. And then Protestants kind of got to the point where they said, "Hey, there's some abuses happening here, and there is something else in Scripture that points to the authority of Scripture, and that faith is not through the church, but through Christ." And so this is, and that's not to say that modern day Roman Catholics would say that faith is through the church, but faith is mediated through the church, because in the same way that Peter was sort of given the keys of the kingdom and was the first pope, according, to the mindset of the Catholic Church, in that papal succession that comes down, so that the church was always governed and guided and led by a figure. So again, if you've ever heard that, Peter was the first pope, all the way up to the present pope, and they see that as papal succession. What else? I said this on Sunday, Paul, that Romans is such a significant book for all. I mean, and other than Jim, who's a Roman Catholic, but I still think, Jim, you appreciate Protestant theology. For all of us, it is probably the most important book, and we can probably, without thinking about it, completely underestimate the significance of the book, because what happened was Paul wrote, and then in the 4th century when they were canonizing stuff, and we'll talk about the different up to the 4th century, there were only 14 chapters, but we have 16 chapters. We'll talk about it in a second. But as they were figuring those things out, Augustine was a major a thinker in the 4th century. You've heard of St. Augustine? Yeah? So he's the one who gave us infant baptism. He gave us original sin. He gave us the doctrine of human depravity. He set the stage. And basically what Augustine did was reinterpret Paul for a 4th century developing nation, Christendom, a nation of Christians. And then that guides, and then there was the fall of Rome, and everything goes dark. And Benedictine spirituality is what brings about it. And Saint Benedict was definitely influenced by Paul, maybe not as Augustine. And then you have 500 years where you have a lot of stuff going on between the East and the West. You have the development of monasticism. And then in the sort of 11th, 12th, 13th century, you have a sort of a revisiting of Paul's theology. You see it in Aquinas. And then you see it heavily in the 16th century, again, because the church was claiming so much authority. Romans presents a authority that comes from, not necessarily just purely from Scripture, really from faith, through grace. And it sort of revolutionizes the way we think. So for the last 500-600 years, we've wrestled with this notion of grace by faith alone. Now, was the Catholic Church going to say that salvation comes through them? No. It's mediated through, but they also see themselves as a church, as the true church of Christ's body on earth. So there's authority in that. We, as Protestants in general, don't place that authority on the church. The church is a handmaiden. The church is the bride. The church is the hands and feet. The church is not the authority. And I like that personally because all I see is a broken church through 2,000 years. And actually a broken Israel before that, because human sin has always affected us, which is addressed in Romans. So for me, the authority comes from both the self-authenticating word of Christ coming in the scriptures, but the revelation of Christ that comes to us as individuals, reflecting that new covenant of God's going to write his law on our hearts. There's a lot of debate overall whether this is a private letter or a public epistle. Many of Paul's writings are like, hey, I'm writing Timothy. This is my issue with kind of like, hey, I want to hold those a little bit lighter, because maybe Paul was espousing doctrine, but Paul was teaching a person rather than something written for the church. And Romans is absolutely something that is written for a variety of reasons, presupposed, and we'll talk about those in a minute. I think that some people call it an essay letter. It's written like a letter that could reflect just the literary expression of the time. It expresses, no doubt, some of Paul's most mature thought. But I would say, and for many of us who view it from a theological viewpoint, see it as it's the first systematic theology. It takes it is based out of an argument for faith by grace alone, or salvation by faith by grace alone.
I thought he was writing in Romans. I thought he was writing to churches.
He is writing to the church in Rome, but he had never been to Rome.
But to different churches, not just to Rome.
Well, he was writing to the church in Rome, and here's the thing: for the first 4 centuries or 3 centuries of the church, this is why the discrepancy between there are manuscripts that have 14 chapters, manuscripts that have 15 chapters in Romans, and manuscripts that have 16 chapters. Now, there are some that think that the original manuscripts were the 16, or probably 15 chapters, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more, that 16th chapter, because it kind of presents some new things. But that 15th chapter, it stopped there. And part of the reason is there was a doxology. Paul ends. He's like done. And it corresponds or is congruent with his other letters that he wrote. He begins a certain way, he ends a certain way. Now in this, he begins a little bit of a nuance. He ends in a little bit of, he ends in the doxology, and then we have a whole other chapter added on. And some think that that actually was a letter to Ephesus, to the church in Ephesus, that was appended later. But what's interesting about that is prior to the 400s, when they canonized all 16 chapters to say those were the authoritative, that was the authoritative version of Romans, the 14 chapter versions, manuscripts, did not include mention of Rome. So there are a number of passages actually that were, and I don't remember what they are off the top, but there are a number of passages that strip out, I'll read them at some point, strip out a couple verses early on and take out 16 altogether. Now the challenge of that is 16 gives us a lot, 15 and 16 actually give us a lot of information. So what you have again, and this is what, I've been saying this for almost 5 years now. The Bible's a messy book. It is. I mean, just knowing this, seeing it, why would it makes no sense that Paul would give a doxology and then append it later with another chapter, which just adds on some information. Now, maybe it was nuanced at the beginning and they chopped that out to circulate that letter to others. Al.
How long did it take him to write this?
Part of that, he at the end of his 3rd missionary journey, he had preached all around the Aegean Sea, which if you think about Greece being here, this is the Mediterranean, Aegean Sea is over here, and Turkey's over here. This whole region, Macedonia, Ephesus, and Asia, Asia, I guess it would be Asia, not really Asia, but that whole region. He had preached the inclusion of the Gentiles to all of the regions that he felt called to through three missionary endeavors. And then in 49, what you have is, and this isn't actually I'm jumping around a little bit, but since you asked the background of it, in 49, they think that Paul finished his missionary journey and then traveled across from Ephesus to Corinth. And it's thought that he stayed for about 3 years in Corinth. I believe that's what it is. Did I say that right, or was it
I thought he
Ephesus?
wrote them all from prison.
No, he didn't. Because he was planning a trip to go to Jerusalem, and then from Jerusalem he was going to go to Rome, and then from Rome he was going to go on to Spain. And we'll read that passage here in a moment that says his trajectory. But what was happening in that time is leading up to the 50s. First of all, you have the Jerusalem Council, which was this big council in Jerusalem between Jews and Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians about whether circumcision was necessary. And they concluded in the Jerusalem Council in 50 that circumcision was not something that was necessary. So there's thought that there was a lot of noise around this time, and Emperor Claudius didn't like that noise. And so what happens is you have this sort of this rise of Jewish Christianity, and you have this conflict between Jews, between what it means, and Claudius was so disturbed by the fact that there was so much noise. He called the Jews disruptors, and that includes Jewish Christians and Judaism Jews, that he kicked them all out of Rome. So I don't mean we're trying to find the date of it. He did let them back in. So in 49, the Jews were expelled by Claudius, and then he died in 54.
He who?
Claudius.
Okay.
So there's this passage in Rome where Paul meets up with Ananias and Sapphira, and they had just come from Rome, and it correlates the whole story of they had just been kicked. They're Jewish Christians that were kicked out of Rome, and he meets them in Corinth, So for 5 years there were no Jews. I mean, probably sure there were still some, but in general, from 49 to mid 50s, there were Jewish population in Rome was very low. And one of the presuppositions around some of these issues is that as the Jewish Christians left, say in 49, because they were kicked out, and then what you were left with was Gentile Christians in Rome.
So didn't you have a conflict between the two? I mean, the Jews thought y'all still lived by the Jewish law, circumcision,
Yes.
being kosher and all that, and the Gentiles felt like you didn't have to do that.
Well, yeah, and it was less about the eating and more about the circumcision. Because, I mean, you can imagine as adult males, they're like, hey, it's good for you, but I'm not down with that. Maybe that's why the emphasis is on faith rather than works. I just believe, that's good enough.
So,
Keep those scissors away from me.
what I'm reading in here, were
Yeah.
they all gay? Like to me, they all, and
What are you talking about?
right here, they're all talking about,
Wait.
Well, you think about that question. We'll come back to that in a
I mean,
second.
it's here in the book.
Well, no, yeah, well, in a moment, we'll
I think you know what he's talking about.
Oh.
He's talking about that women are lovers of women and men are.
get to that when we get into the book. We'll get into the
I'm
details of
sorry.
it. But no, right now we're talking about the movement of Rome. So
sorry.
here's what's
I'm
important.
sorry.
No, here's what's important for you to
Was he
understand.
gay? All gay?
No, Paul was not gay.
Okay.
And Paul, and
sorry.
maybe he was. I don't know. Maybe he was. I mean, he has no evidence of a
Sounds like
wife.
he was.
But I'm not going to allow you to
I'll stay
derail
with
me.
you.
You can just
I'll-
stay
I'll-
that.
I'll-
Keep that to your.
I'm sorry.
We'll come back to that.
I'm sorry.
But here's the important thing to understand about the context that Romans was written in, is that there weren't Jews or Jewish Christians in Rome in the early 50s. Therefore, the Gentile Christians that existed there would have developed over I've been here for 5 years. Think about, just sort of that to give you a sense of time frame. A lot can happen in 5 years. So then Claudius dies in 54, and Jews start to return. And it is around the return of these Jews that we presuppose or we think that Paul wrote the book of Romans while in Corinth. The dates are late 55 to early 56, or late 53 to early 57. It really doesn't make a difference what tells you in that. I mean, some have suggested, but largely been debunked,
So a couple
as
years.
early as 51 that he started writing it. But really it was around that. If it was 55 to 57, which is what most scholars agree probably was written, it means Claudius had died, Jews are returning, and now for, again, a rejuvenated, prior to the Jerusalem Council, there was arguments about whether circumcision was necessary. That's what led up to that. They determined it's not, And then 5 years later, Jews are returning to Rome, and now you all of a sudden have a Gentile influenced church that is not following any Jewish regulations. And then you have Jews that have arrived back and are like, hey, what'd you do to the church? So when Paul is writing, he says, I'm writing first to the Jews. Paul is very specific. He's very delicate. He's very intentional of addressing both Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians. But he's writing first to the Jews, in part because he's trying to communicate something. Now, here's the thing about it. He says this very clearly, and I'll read this there in a second, but he's writing to the church in Rome. Paul has never been to Rome at this point. Paul did not establish churches at this point. Paul longs to go to Rome. And what Paul is doing is he's seeding a letter to Rome. And this is the other reason that the 16th chapter has a very familiar nature to it. He's talking to church like he knows it. So that's why it's thought that it's often written to the church in Ephesus. But as Paul is writing this, he's writing this with a couple purposes in mind. I don't want to miss any of these. One, he's to present a non-Jewish understanding of the gospel, because he's writing to the Gentile Christians in Rome. But he also is taking into account that Jews come in. So he's addressing, all throughout Romans, he addresses the Jews. And in fact, Luther used Paul's writings in Romans to sort of tip or to make some comments of an anti-Semitic nature, because it sort of says the Jews crucified him, and it kind of puts them, and we'll talk about that in more detail when the time comes. But to write that, so two, he wanted to announce his plans to prepare the church in Rome. Now, the church had already existed, and some might say Peter started the church in Rome, and that's why Peter, Pope, Paul, and the papal authority and all that together. But the reality is that they think that the church in Rome was probably started by Pentecost Christians who eventually migrated there, and then the church was seeded. And that the dominant, there's arguments against Peter's. There's definitely lots of arguments against Paul starting the church in Rome. Maybe that's why Rome is so Roman Catholic. There are many arguments for Peter starting the church in Rome, but most scholars would say the church probably predates Peter's arrival in Rome as well. And just that, and what I love about that is the idea that there were Pentecostal Christians or Christians from the Pentecost who were baptized in the Spirit in other languages and went into other lands, and so there was the diaspora of the gospel that went out. I'm jumping around a bit, but it's okay. Let's just go through so a couple other things just to sort of introduce, and we'll come back to some of these anyways. I said earlier on that it covers the main doctrines. It doesn't cover everything. So to say that it's complete would be, I think that's your judgment of complete. I think what it touches on is great. I don't think it touches on everything, but I think it touches on a vast majority of things that are important, in particular to the foundations. When we talk about basic doctrines of depravity or sinfulness or justification or salvation or sanctification, these are theological words, and they may be unfamiliar to you, they may be familiar to you, but if you're not familiar with them, by the end of this exploration of Romans, they should be. These are the foundations of how a human being comes through the process of faith. And Paul lays those out for us. There's a general agreement that Paul, as I said, wrote it, save for the 16th chapter. And that's not to say that even Paul didn't write it, but that Paul didn't write that in particular to the Romans, and we'll get to that again. But there's a match in style, there's a match in vocabulary, there's a congruence with his theology and some of his historical connections. All of it is good. Again, it's probably the least contested book or letter that Paul has written. That's just Louis, ignore him. It wasn't written probably by Paul, actually, in terms of that. It names a scribe, not to say that Paul maybe not wrote some of it, but Tertius is the scribe, and he was the bishop of Iconium, which is in central Turkey. And that just means that there was a figure that traveled with Paul, and when Paul spoke, Paul wasn't the most eloquent writer, so a lot of his books were written by others. And that's okay. That's not a problem for most. We talked about the dating. The audience was the Romans, was the church in Rome for at least the first 14 chapters, 15 chapters. And then you can strip out those Roman references and it can become something for everyone. But it was written towards the church in Rome. And the thought was, as you'll see in the prologue, he wants to introduce himself. He wants to establish himself as an apostle. And he wants to use that authority to communicate things to the church in Rome. We take all this for granted. It's kind of like if you had a church just a group of us went off into the middle of nowhere, and decided, well, no, we live in the middle of nowhere, so.
I bit my tongue, I bit my
Yeah,
tongue.
we kind of live in the middle of it. Well, and then just started teaching, but from what they knew. But that doesn't mean those first century Christians had developed theology. They didn't have an array of books. They had the Old Testament canon, but that wouldn't have told them anything or given them much to go on. They didn't have the New Testament books. So when you imagine that church in Rome, what you're imagining on is the base. Now, granted, I think the Spirit was more at work and more powerful then to some extent, but there was no guidance. There was no deep theology. When we talk about these things, you're like, oh yeah, I understand. I see you nodding your heads. But if you hadn't had the basis of a childhood perhaps growing up or not, if you hadn't had Sunday school, if you hadn't been confirmed, if you hadn't been in Bible studies your whole life, imagine all of that wiped away. And then you're left to figure out what faith is. This is why the first 3 centuries of the church were the messiest time liturgically or doctrinally or theologically that we've ever had in the church, because no one had any sort of guidance. This is what the 4th century gave us. Taking those books, systematizing them, creating doctrines out of them, and helping the church to flourish. It's also what gave the church its authority. We're now unified. It's kind of the idea of as we unify in our idea. If everyone in this room has a different idea, about what this is, the pencil, we're like, no, it's not a pencil, it's a stick. No, it's not a stick, it's a poker. Everyone has a different idea. Then when there's no cohesiveness in our thought, and we can't move together around the idea of what this is. But when you gather around your ideas around something and share a common thought or an understanding, then you have a collective, cohesive group with a plausibility structure that says we can move forward and understand. And that's what Paul is trying to do. He's giving them a structure to understand their faith so that they can be unified. And in particular, whatever dissension was before the Council of Jerusalem and the whole circumcision thing, he was facing in that writing after. So Paul is seeing and hearing and understanding that as Jews return, there's conflict. So he's motivated to address the issues of the conflict, but he also feels like he's fulfilled his duties. And he's going to make this trip, and it says he's going to go to Jerusalem and bring some goods, and then he's going to make his way to Rome. And then ultimately, he wants to go to Spain, where there weren't many Jews, not to say there weren't any, but out of the Mediterranean, that sort of reason, and into this sort of the edge of the world, and actually there's a spot in Spain on the far northwestern corridor called the Finisterre, which is the end of the earth. And it was thought for those on the continent that was the end of the earth. So he's going to an unreached area. Yeah, if you do the Camino, the Spanish Trail, yes. After you get to St. James, to Santiago, you can do another leg at the end to a place called Finisterre, and you're supposed to strip down naked and run in the ocean. So yeah, that's what you do. I wouldn't do it. Actually, I probably would. If I did the Camino.
Say, why not?
Why not? I was doing, yeah. We'll see. It depends who's there that day.
How long does it take you to travel all this distance?
Oh, a long time.
I mean,
Years.
you're not talking.
Years.
Walking most of it.
Oh, yeah. Or riding perhaps would be there was no mode of transportation, so.
They wouldn't take boats.
They would, and that was the reason it's thought that he wrote it in Corinth, because actually Phoebe, and we'll talk about her in a second, Phoebe, one of the female deacons, the only female deacon and leader, and who was named a servant of the church that Paul explicitly names. And she was a leader in the Christian church at the time, and we'll talk about her, but she was the deliverer of Romans to the church in Rome. So she was the messenger. And so that, you got to understand, and when we talk about women's role in the church, Phoebe is a shining example of Paul entrusting his most, it's not like he was like, hey, here's a copy of my newest book, take it with you. Chances are it was the only. Yeah, it was probably the only copy. It wasn't like he was going like, hey, copy that on this so I have an extra copy in case I want to work on it later. It was like, here, take this and go. So he entrusted her with something that for 2,000 years has guided the church. So there's some significance in that.
So to answer your question, I have notes in here that say it took 2-3 years for each of his missions, because he did 4. So 2-3 years of walking.
Well, those are the missionary journeys, and this
Right.
is after the third missionary
Right.
journey. And so when Paul actually, after this, it leads into, so he was in, when he wrote this, he didn't deliver it himself.
Get a lot of contemplative time.
Well, he put it in the US mail, that's why it took 3 years to get.
No, but it was. I mean, and honestly, like, that's something to say about our present day, I mean, but that goes all the way up through the last century. The contemplative time that we as a culture have always had has grown less and less the more technologically advanced we've become. And, you go back to, imagine Thoreau walking, into the woods and Walden Pond and all that sort of stuff. Like that's time to contemplate. But we fill our lives with lots of busyness, and that doesn't always happen. As I said, the canonicity, or was canonized with many other books in the Council of Rome in 382. I don't even know what that means, what I wrote. What do we have here? Paul. I don't know what that means. 5 times, wait. I don't even know what that means either. I wrote these things down. So it was probably, just in terms of where it was probably written they think in the house of Gaius, Gaius, who was in Corinth. And again, Paul traveled from Greece. Paul, after Acts, Paul was in Greece for 3 months prior to going to Rome. And I said 3 years, but I think it's 3 months. Sometimes I write months and years. I was like, 3 years or months? I wrote months here. I'm not 100% sure right at this moment. But the point is that that he was in Corinth when he wrote it, and he was staying at a friend's house. And so this was like his thinking time. This was like his preparation time. This was his. We talked about the purpose. Okay, I think that's about it for the background that I want to touch on. I'm sure we'll come into some of that as we get into the text. Any questions before we move on to form, from online or in person?
How did the apostles make a living and provide for eating and traveling and all that?
They relied on the hospitality and tent making. Oftentimes when they were in places, they picked up jobs. Yeah. But largely through the generosity of the church. I mean, and it's the very notion of the priestly role. It still comes through. Although there was some sense of not being tied in the same connection to the community, the reliance of that comes in Paul, and he sort of says, make your own living. And there are people who do that today. I mean, they do an outside job and they're pastor. You can trace the professionalization of pastoral ministry throughout the church to the present day, but it all harkens back to sort of the notion of the priest. How did the priest eat in Israel? Because people brought food.
It's like the Buddhist monks.
Well, yeah, the same thing. I mean, in every religion, it's all because here's the thing: is you're betrothed to. There's kind of a submission to the will of God that God will provide.
It looks like it would have been more difficult for them. Christianity was not known to the extent that it is today, and people didn't accept it. I mean, he was in many cases talking to people that hadn't heard the message.
Absolutely, and to Jews who were like, "I thought we just abandoned this." And the Jews were bringing stuff to the temple in a very different way. That there was no church; it was a house church. So what would happen is you would get kind of a more like the early Great Awakening, where you'd have itinerant preachers go around, and teachers too, for that matter, in schoolhouses. But they would go and they would stay with people, and the people would support them, and and maybe they would collect an offering for some. But it was not a ministry in large part until probably the last century has never been. I mean, I guess. I think there were some corrupt times in history where it was lucrative, but in large part ministry has never been lucrative till the last century, and then part of that's the professionalization of it. The more we have made it an industry of professionalization, the more we have matched the work of the church to that with an industry outside of the church. We as session members, we get together and we talk about insurance, and we talk about those are all things that all nonprofits talk about, and it comes into play. So in some ways we have. And you could even say in the last 30 to 40 years, as we've seen the professionalization of youth ministry, prior to that, youth ministry was a volunteer position or something the pastor would sort of minister to the church or the youth of the church. Anything as it becomes professionalized, now you can major in youth ministry, you can, there's an array of books and resources for youth ministry, and the professionalization is taken over. What else do I think that was it that I wanted to touch on. So let's talk about form. As I said, some versions early on had 14 chapters. Later on, they had 15 and 16. By the time the fourth century had come around, 16 chapters were thought to have been complete. But that 16th chapter, again, was an add-on, or thought to have been an add-on, but it was okay because it's still thought to have Paul potentially as the author. But I think that there are those who think that that fuller version was the original version, because in the manuscripts that only have 14, you're missing a lot of the material. But it wasn't until the mid fourth century that they agreed upon it. And another reason they think of that is because Tertullian and Origen, our church fathers that came before the third century, or the fourth century, only refer to Romans as a 14 chapter book. Now, this has implications. Is it a 16 chapter book? Is it a 14 chapter book? Are the last two chapters okay to read as authoritative? Are they canon? Well, a group of men in the fourth century decided it was okay, and they stuck them all in there. But this is the challenge, and again, to all the way to really after the Reformation, when you had some, the Apocrypha being chopped off, from the fourth century to the 16th, 17th, 16th century, you've got a pretty fluid canon. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not agreement, but the agreement was, let's take this, and the reason I'm pointing this out because it's important to understand that the understanding of canonization, or the authority of a book, is not the same authority we give today. Even Jews look at Jewish writing, the Old Testament, what we call the Old Testament, the Old Covenant, in different categories. There's the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. Those were given directly to Moses, although I question that, because he wrote about his death before he died. I mean, that's the weird thing, is someone added something to it, and there's lots of different author theories. But in general, God gave those first 5 books, and Jews hold them as the highest authority. This was given by God's direct hands. The second level are the prophets, because they contain the words of God. But even some of the story elements around the prophetic words are sort of like, yeah, it's okay. It's not going to be perfect. And then you have the writings, and that's where you get in the history. That's where you get into the wisdom books. You get into song, those sort of things. You get into poetry. You get into the apocalyptic books, or the prophetic books. Those are held, or Esther and Job and some of those things at the Great Assembly after the return from exile put into play. Those are kind of held pretty lightly. We don't do that. And again, this is something I preached last summer. From 1820 on, the evangelical church said the inerrancy of the Bible required everything to be perfect as is, written by God, and let's find some codes in and do all those things. And I'm not denying that there are codes in the Bible. But my point is, for 1800 years of the church, and prior to that, no one really held Scripture in this perfect. It was set apart because it was sacred. And so when we deal with the fact that we're looking at these 2 add-on chapters, it doesn't really matter. And this is, again, the point that I continually beat down. The technicalities don't matter. That's the errors. That's the claim of inerrancy. The infallibility, the truth that is revealed, that's the part that, as a theologian, I'm concerned about, and we as a body of faith should be concerned about. Our goal is coherent and cohesive understanding of the theology that Paul is presenting. Not here, although we're going to critique some of these little things. It doesn't take away from the authority, and that's really what I'm trying to point to. A couple other reasons. So early manuscripts lacked references to Rome, and they think that those were the circulating copies. Some of the early copies explicitly mention Corinth as the place of writing. So there was, in some of those early manuscripts, again, discrepancies. Some mentioned it, some didn't. Was it taken out? Maybe it was. Was it put in? Maybe it was. But they mentioned Corinth as a place. That's why we believe it's Corinth. Some mention Phoebe as the deliverer in more detail, and she was a Christian leader, and so she sort of stands out. In large part, here it is. If you 1:7, 1:15 in chapters 15 through 16 were removed. So if you want to take it out of if you want to stop calling it Romans, you take the last 2 chapters out, a couple sections here, and you just got Paul's letter. take total, and you could take those out, and then if you presented it, you would have no idea he was talking to Rome. It would just be something that he was writing. It's thought to be written to the unchurched, or has an unchurched flavor to it, in the same way John does. And part of that reason is even though he's writing to the church, he's explaining it to them. He's, in some sense, he's acquiescing his writing to the Jews to explain the Gentile theology, but he's also acquiescing to the Gentiles, explaining some of the Jewish basis. And then what you get in that is you really get a presentation of the gospel for someone who's neither Jew or around Jewish Christians or the Judaism, that then you would all of a sudden have this presentation of this something that came out of this Middle Eastern region of the world and is being presented in an unchurched area. What does that say? Oh, yeah, I know. Yeah, sometimes I write stuff down, I don't remember. The theory here, this goes into the 16th chapter, the theory that it's a separate letter to a church in Ephesus, in part because 1533, the end of 15, contains a benediction that matches the other biblical books. And also in 16, Paul greets a larger group of people with a sense of familiarity. I can flip to there now just so you get a sense. He starts, so you get 16, let me just read the end of it. So the end of 15 says, 15:30 on, 30 to 33 says, "I appeal to you, brothers and sisters, by our Lord Jesus Christ, and by the love of the Spirit, to join me in earnest prayer to God on my behalf." So he's closing out. "Then I may be rescued from the unbelievers in Judea, and then my ministry to Jerusalem may be acceptable to the saints." He's heading to Jerusalem, so that's forethought. "So that by God's will I may come to you with joy, again, to be refreshed in your company. The God of peace be with you all. Amen." Done. He said amen. Then he starts, chapter 16, "I commend to you our sister Phoebe, the deacon of the church in Centuria, so that you may be welcome her in the Lord as a fitting for the saints, and to help her in whatever way she may require of you, for she has been a benefactor of many and of myself as well." And so this is saying, here's this, he is introducing, so this is the idea of that this probably was included. Now, here's the thing. Maybe this was a separate letter that sort of was like a cover letter that introduced who was coming, and then the letter itself was meant to be presented. Yeah. We've tacked it on at the end. Is that by God's design, by God's inspiration, by God's, I don't know. I mean, it's just there. Again, to me, the meat of it that comes out is what's important, not the order of it, because this seems like a tack on to me. So then you get into 3, and this goes back to the whole notion of greet Priscilla and Aquila, or Prisca and Aquila, who worked with me in Jesus Christ and who risked their neck for my life, and who I not only give thanks, but also in the churches, but also all the churches of the Gentiles. Again, maybe they were more churches of Gentiles that were actually there by that time, because the Jews weren't there for 5 years. Greet also the churches in their house. So he's almost recognizing that there are people there and there are churches there. Greet my beloved Epaphras, who was the first convert in Asia for Christ. So that implies that there were Asian or Turkish Christians who then made their way and were in Rome at the time. So there's a presupposition that Christians were there and there were house churches there. Greet Mary, who has worked very hard among you. Greet Andronicus and Junia. I'm butchering all these names, but bear with me. I'm not a biblical scholar, I'm a practical theologian. My relatives who were in prison with me, and they're prominent among the apostles, and they were in Christ before I was. So acknowledging that he came to Christ, even there were those before in Christ before he came. Greet, and he goes on, greet this person, but he's saying all of these things like, but not in a familiar way. So the argument is there. Is this something that was written? And it does change. If it was written to the church in Ephesus, all of this mention of all these people aren't even in Rome. If it is in Rome, then they're in Rome. And so the way you look at it, if it's a tack on and it was a letter written to Ephesus, then all these people he's mentioning aren't in Rome. If they are in Rome and this was a precursor, if this was a cover letter, if this was something that was meant to go with Rome, then it's suggesting that these people have migrated back to Rome or migrated to Rome. Does it matter? Not enormously. What else? Okay. The other thing I want to read to you, before we get into the theological themes, Oh no, so the theory that the 16th chapter, let me finish that. Paul greets a larger group with familiarity. Oh, and then 1 to 15, as we'll look and we'll see very clearly, was written to an unfamiliar audience. All of these, like greet people, greet people, greet people, say hi to so and so, send someone my love. None of that's there. He's writing to a blank audience. He's writing, and then you strip those things out, it can go to everyone. What I do want to read you is Paul's plan to visit to Rome, and this sort of is the precursor, and you'll find this in 15. Again, the question is that a tack on? Not because 14 ends with a benediction, and that's would be the challenge of it, but again, it goes back to benedictions are the ends of letters, which is the tension between was it a letter or was it a treaty written. But we're going to go to 15 verses 22 to 33, which gives you Paul's plan or reason for going to Rome, and it says this. This is the reason that I have so often been hindered from coming to you. Now, this is considered that he's writing to the church, to the Christians in Rome. But now, with no further place for me in these regions, in other words, he's done his job. He's, around the Aegean Sea, around that region. I desire, as I have for many years, to come to you when I go to Spain. So that's where the hint, they're like, well, why is he going to Spain? Well, he's going to Spain. For I do hope to see you on my journey and to be sent on by you once I've enjoyed your company for a little while. And that probably hints to a little bit what you're saying, Ken, is they were paid by, he's going to spend some time with them. They're going to care for him while he's there. At the present, however, I'm going to Jerusalem in a ministry to the saints, for Macedonia and Achaia have been pleased to share their resources with the poor amongst the saints in Jerusalem. So the thought is he's bringing money to Jerusalem for the Christians there. They were pleased to do this, and indeed they owe it to them, for if the Gentiles have come to share in their spiritual blessings, they ought also be a service to them in material things. Hence back to the early church where they had all things in common. So once I have completed this, and I have delivered to them what has been collected, I will set out by way to you, Rome, to Spain. It doesn't say to Rome, it's just I'll set out by way to you to Spain. And I know when I come to you, I will be in the fullness and the blessedness of Christ. I appeal to you, brothers and sisters, by our Lord Jesus Christ, who is acknowledging Christians are there, and by the love of the Spirit, to join me in earnest prayer to God on my behalf, that I may be rescued from the unbelievers in Judea, because he's going through the region of Jerusalem, and that my ministry to Jerusalem may be acceptable to the saints, so that by God's will I may come to you with joy and be refreshed in your company. The God of peace be with you. Amen. Paul.
So are you reading an easier to understand version of the Bible? Because that was written where it's much easier to read than a lot of scriptures.
No, that's just an NRSV. The version, any verse that I ever read ever is always in the NRSV. It's the most scholarly version, and it's considered it's the most attentive to the structure and words, but with also a mindfulness towards the idioms and cultural things. But it's not a paraphrase. So yeah, and there are lots of versions. There's the Revised Standard Version, there's the New Revised Standard Version, and then there's the updated in addition of the New Revised Standard Version. Glenda, were you going to say something?
No.
Okay. So all that's to say is, first 14 chapters, the heart of it. 15th chapter, a little bit more. You got some extra stuff in there. We'll look at those and sort of some plans and expressed. 16th chapter, don't even know if it was written to the Romans. If it was, it means that Christians, he's recognizing that he has connections there, but not necessarily, but never been there. He's talking about just the Christians that are there. In general, and we'll talk about this, but in general, the theological themes that you're going to find running through this, and it's kind of the entirety of the major ones, but human depravity and sinfulness. Paul talks about just the struggle between flesh and spirit. And we'll talk about the Gnostic nature of that, the Greek influence on that of almost like the flesh is bad and the spirit is good. And admittedly, I very much am in that vein. I say anyone who's had a kid or a mother who has dementia, when you strip out our rationality and you're left with the bare instinctual nature of humanity, you see a base sinfulness that is undeniable. You see it in kids. Kids are selfish. They're, and again, I joke about my mom. My mom is in a vascular dementia brings you to a state of a childhood. My mom has the mind of a 2-year-old. So, one of the things I wrestle with her is like, I feel like she, it's a 77-year-old acting like a 2-year-old. You don't like when teenagers do it. We love her. And by the grace of God, which is also a major theme. And this is why Romans became a major, important book for the Reformation, because the grace of God exists over the judgment of God. And the judgment of God, in large part, is what the Catholic Church used in order to motivate people to buy indulgences, to put money into coffers, to pay alms, to do these acts of penance. Now, I don't blame the Catholic Church. That was an evolution of what they were thinking and the way they understood. Everything has basis and understanding. The Catholic Church understood that. And here's the thing. Every generation of the church has been corrupt from the very beginning. There's no escaping sin. From the beginning of the establishment of Christendom, there's problems all the way up through. You go up and you get some major disagreements and major ugliness through, from 300 to 1,000, and then from 1,000 to 1,500, you get this massive split in the church. Again, sin. You get the Crusades in there. How ugly is that? You get the abuse and the indulgences. You get even after, in every monastic movement, even though the church was saved by some sense by monasticism, or our understanding the church was saved by monasticism, there's all sorts of abuse in monasticism. There's been all sorts of abuse in the church. The Holocaust was justified. Slavery was justified. Our current obsession with prosperity is justified. All of this is constantly pointing back to the depravity of humanity and the grace of God. And we're going to see those themes heavily come out in Paul. He does deal a lot with Jewish and Gentile conflict and the harmony between those, but he does with those, I think, and we'll point that out when it happens, very intentionally. He speaks to the different groups, and again, he's speaking first to the Jews, Jewish Christians, that's more so than Jews, but he's trying to find some sense of harmony around things like circumcision, around things like legalism and eating pork and doing that, and basically in the essence of all of this was what I would say is God has constantly acquiesced to the stupidness of humanity, and Jesus comes on the scene and says, it's not about what you do, it's about your character and your spirit. And it's a pretty scary thing. It's not about actually acting on an adulterous, instinct. Jesus said it's not about adultery. It's not about actually doing it. If you look at a woman with lust in your eyes, you're committing adultery. So this is about the condition of our spirit. Jesus raises the bar pretty high. And it's not about just following the laws and doing all things. In fact, as we've seen over the last few weeks in church, Jesus said himself, it's not offerings and sacrifices that you desire. The ultimate sacrifice is our own humanity, our own sense of self-interest. The funny thing, just as an aside, we were just watching, saw us at a podcast over the Christmas break about the first 3 episodes of Star Wars. So you'd never seen them. We watched, not the original not the only real Star Wars series, the 4, 5, 6, which I would call 1, 2, and 3. The beginning, the first 3, whatever, the Clone Wars or whatever they were, the prelude or whatever, the prequel. But what was interesting is we were watching those is Anakin Skywalker, who's Darth Vader, and it's a story basically how he became evil. He says at one point, Jedis are always self-sacrificing, always self-giving. The Sith, meaning the evil side of the Force, are always self-gratifying. And they make this incredible theological claim between the powers of good and evil, and that exists throughout all of this. You'll see these sort of cosmic themes of good and evil and the battling. But again, it goes back to the idea that we're called in a material sense, and Paul will say this, we're called to sacrifice who we are. And I don't live like this, probably, I know I don't, none of us do, and I think the church doesn't in general. But really, if we took serious, if we really, if we knew that in 1 year Jesus was coming back, all of a sudden, everything that we have in this world would not really matter. We'd be living a lot differently. We'd be thinking a lot differently. And the gospel is calling us, and Paul is calling us to think like that, as if Christ was coming back tomorrow, as if Christ was coming back. And that's a tall order, especially in a day of prosperity. Well, I think the Western world has lost its compass in a lot of ways. And unfortunately, I think we all fall into that category. So Faith alone, we've talked about that. Well, that'll be a major theme that comes through. Justification and sanctification. I'm sure you've heard, and we'll mention this again, justification. The easiest way to remember that is just as if I had never sinned. We're sort of wiped away, and that's a declaration of our removal of the stain of sinfulness. And Paul goes into that stain that Adam gives us, and then Christ basically reverses the curse. And this goes back to this summer as I was talking about the place at the table, and I talked a little bit about men and women. Men and women had a relationship prior to the fall, one of equity, one of mutuality, different roles. The Bible describes them as different. They're not the same. They're not doing things exactly the same. Different order, but no hierarchy, both containing the image of God. In the fall, patriarchy entered the world. It says, God said to Eve, your desire shall be for the man, and he shall rule over you. Well, henceforth, I think that would have happened regardless, just by physicality and survival of the fittest. You may not like that theory, but it's, I think, a theory that proves true in many ways. But when the Pentecost came, when the Spirit came, it means we're going back. We're in the word that Paul uses, the recapitulation, to go back to the garden. What Adam did, what Adam brought into the world through the tree, eating the apple, Christ reversed by dying on a tree. So Christ, in Paul's view in Romans, is called the second Adam. It's a whole lovely doctrine called recapitulation, and we'll talk about that in a few weeks. Sanctification is mentioned a lot. That's the idea, and this is where the Roman Catholic Church took the idea of sanctification and said you have to continue to purify yourself and to set yourself aside of righteousness and piety and all those things, and that's where you get the idea of the seeding of the notion of purgatory. Purgatory is a time of refining. Of course, I think right now we're in purgatory now. If it's true, I think this is purgatory. And if you've ever seen the movie Lost, they think that's purgatory, or the show Lost. Did anyone watch Lost? Anyone when that came out? The plane goes down and there's kind of this alternate world. They can't find them. Theologically, it's a phenomenal metaphor for purgatory. If that's something maybe it's purgatory, maybe it's not. I mean, that has implications of thinking that. I said that more joking, but
There's actually a Western called Purgatory that talks about purgatory.
yeah, and actually there's a city in Colorado called Purgatory.
Yeah.
Skier.
Yeah, you can ski there.
That's cute.
One of the major themes of Romans
Durango.
Yeah.
is God's providence and election. So you probably heard the term predestination or double predestination or election. These are things that undoubtedly come from the book of Romans, and this is considered Paul's mature thought. And this is one of the reasons I think that I am in the Reformed tradition and not in a Arminian tradition. And although I have lots of Arminian tendencies around free will, but the very idea that God chose us, the term that we'll talk about is called superlapsarianism. And that is saying that before the foundations of the earth, that God chose who would be a part of the elect and who would not. And that's a reprehensible doctrine for us because it's the idea that God has ordained some of the human beings in this world for destruction or as reprobate, but it's hard to get away from in Paul's writings, and we're going to have to face that from sort of 5 to 8, in chapters 5 to 8. Believers transformed, or the transformation of believer, that's that justification, the sanctification, and I think that's really kind of the major theme. Okay, let's go through just briefly, and then we'll call it a day, because I know I've probably thrown too much at you already. But here's the thing is, as you start, the things that I'm saying to you, if you actually go back and this week read 2 chapters a day, you're going to hear some of these things. If you don't read those and you come in next week, then you're going to be coming in just with what you heard this today, and it's not. So if you really want to get the most out of this, take over your morning coffee, read 2 chapters. It'll take you 10 minutes. Romans is broken up into a lot of different ways, and we're going to break it up into some themed categories. We see in the very beginning his prologue, and in that you'll get his greeting, which is very typical for Paul's writings. You'll get his justification of his apostleship, because again, he's writing to a church he doesn't know, or churches people he doesn't know, so he's got to prove himself. Here are my credentials, so to speak. He connects Jesus to David in the prologue, which again, Jews first. He's trying to make that early connection. So for those Jews who are, and then he states his desire to preach. So the first section then from one after the prologue, which goes to about 1:17, you get 1:18 to 3:20, and that'll be largely the first. Next week we're going to begin looking at that, and that's salvation through Christ alone. He makes the idea that, or suggests the statement that God's judgment on Gentiles, God has had judgment on Gentiles because of their idolatry. And there's this passage where it talks about, I think it's in Acts, maybe it's in Romans, where there's this guy, I don't remember his name, but he doesn't like the fact that Paul's walking around basically questioning the cosmology or the mythology of Greek thinking, where there's all these gods. And so there were these idol makers or makers that would, and basically Paul's saying these are all false. He's threatening a whole industry. And so a part of addressing that part of God's judgment on the Gentiles is because they were idolatrous and worshiping other or elevating other deities or projecting other deities. And then he deals with God's judgment on Jews because of their self-righteousness and their hypocrisy. So what he's doing in this nice move is he's basically saying God has judgment for both of y'all. So no one is escaping it. And again, that's that fairness, that's that balance between Jews and Gentiles that he's condemning. And then in 3:9 to 20, he says anything, all are condemned by our works. Jews, Gentiles, there is no saint other than Jesus. And according to Catholic theology, they would actually put Mary in there. That's the Immaculate Conception. That's the miracle of the Immaculate Conception, is that Mary was born without sin. And that's how they get a sinless vessel along with the male side of it being God or the Holy Spirit, and you get two sinless beings conjoining together to produce Christ. Now, some wouldn't hold on to the Immaculate Conception in that, and some would say that Mary was also still tainted with sin, but some of them would say that the sin is passed through the male, and so as long as Mary didn't have to be pure in that regard, as long as the other side of that was pure. So, but we'll get into that a little bit more when the time comes. From 3:21 to 5:11, you have a treaty or a sort of section on the justification through grace. It basically makes the argument that righteousness is that the righteousness that God attributes to us by no merit of our own is basically justification through faith. If we believe, like Abraham, his faith was attributed to him as righteousness. Although he wasn't righteous, he was still fallen. His faith brought him into that state of righteousness. Were you say something? Like you're about to say something? No. Okay. I'll let you just look like you're about to start saying. He goes back to Abraham and he uses Abraham as an example. God always uses faith as the basis, not works. And this is important. And this again goes back to what it says, I don't desire sacrifices, I don't desire burnt offerings. Those are works. That's duty. In 5:1 to 11, he talks about what justification does and that God justifies us and that he reconciles Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and all the way along. They're all justified by this faith that is 100% given out of grace. And the doctrine of grace is that we receive something that we do not deserve. Then he goes into basically 12 to 9:11 is the assurance of salvation. He talks about in 5 the recapitulation. That's that doctrine that Christ was the second Adam. And I love this, personally, I love this doctrine, and in large part because there are many in our current theological landscape that would want to completely deny Adam and Eve as beings, they're just sort of metaphysical or metaphorical figures. And I think that when you talk about Christ being the second Adam, it has to be an acknowledgement that Adam was Adam. Adam was Adam. Because otherwise, what's the point of having a second Adam if Adam wasn't real and Christ was real? And then you get into it. So I like Paul's acknowledgement of, do I hold Adam and Eve as literal characters in Scripture? Yes and no. I think I do. I mean, I want to, in all of my teaching I do, and but I don't think that they were the same. I think that, but I think the story, the details around them, I think are somewhat metaphorical or allegorical. They're meant to teach. They're not meant to describe. It's kind of like the difference between evolution and creation. Those who want to espouse the seven-day creation say, this is what the passage says. And that is saying, this is the literal description of whatever happened in the material world. And I say, that's kind of just a general suggestion. Not to say that God couldn't have snapped God's fingers or breathed or spoke something into existence 100%. But as a mainline Protestant, Reformed Protestant, I still hold on to evolution, that God evolved the world through millions of years. But I do hold on to the idea that Adam and Eve were those unique creatures placed in a garden, and that is the reason Paul then sort of validates that in his own thinking. In chapter 6, did someone say? What'd you say? Did you say something? I thought it was Glenda. Did I hear Glenda's voice? You just telling?
No,
You telling Jim to stop fooling around?
no, wasn't us.
Okay, in chapter 6, that we're like Christ and are dying and rising, so now we are slaves to righteousness. And this is a pretty powerful thing because it means he's pointing to the denial of self. He talks about marriage like salvation. And so he'll use the metaphor of marriage, which is interesting because Paul wasn't married. But he'll use that in terms of just connecting the sense of fidelity or the sense of commitment that's there, the covenant of that. And then later on in other books, he talks about the covenant of marriage in that way regard as well, that we're the bride of Christ. Chapter 8, we're about the notion of the Spirit, that we're alive in the Spirit, and he deals with the whole notion of the flesh-spirit dichotomy. And for me, growing up in the Assemblies of God, this was amazing. Chapter 8 of Romans is a huge passage for me. Because it's kind of like, you know what, in your spirit you want to do what's right, but in your flesh you feel like you can't, and you feel weak. And I think that there's this, and you could put it like angels on your shoulders talking back and forth, or you could say it's your psychology, or whatever way you want to put that. We all have been in those places where we're like, I know what I'm called to do, but I don't feel like I can. And sometimes we do what we're called to do, and sometimes we don't. The devil made me do it.
Got the angel here and the devil sitting here.
So we'll deal with that in a very real way. And I think you see Paul, and I think you see a vulnerability in Paul that I think is amazing. Because Paul doesn't know this church, and he's revealing his own sense of struggle. And you see the vulnerability. You could talk, write a book about the leadership that Paul offers here. Not that he was always perfect, but that was a good moment. Later in 8, that will be glorified as God's children, along with all of creation. And so that there's the promise of the mortification of the dying of our flesh and the rising. So we become little Jesuses. In the same way Jesus went to the cross by obedience, we're called by obedience to deny ourselves and to take up our cross. So he's making a parallel in the sense of we're the minions of Jesus, we're the replicas in this world.
We're a minion.
From 9 to 11, he gets into the providence election. He argues that providence or election determines God's children. He deals with the idea, a little bit of theodicy, and we're going to wrestle with that. That'll be an interesting week, the idea that does God ordain bad things to happen, or do they just happen on their own? And then we'll deal with the doctrine of election a little bit in that. And later in 9, the humility is the fear of God. And I think this is a great passage to remind us that it's so easy to be bolstered in our own humanness and to think that we're important. And I think that recognition that we're both unique and special and loved by God, but also we're dispensable. We are. I mean, when you think about the history of humanity, even some of the greatest thinkers of the world, this was part of the reason I left the national office. I was on this trajectory. I thought I was making a name for myself. And then the main theologian of the denomination in the national office left to go to Columbia Seminary to be a fundraiser. In 6 months, he was there 23 years, influenced all sorts of stuff in the denomination. 6 months after he was gone, it was like, who's Charles Wiley? Yeah, and it was kind of like, and it was a realization that it's all vapor. And anything you think you're going to do in a century, nothing that we've done will matter, except to God. Because God again, importance in the small, but also keeping that sense of humility. Salvation is for all, and Jews knowingly rejected, and this is where you get some of the anti-Semitic stuff that Luther used, that he makes an argument in 11 that God did not reject the Jews, and that it was the Jews were themselves a stumbling block. The Jews' rejection is what, in some sense, not that he says it is because of, but in response to, salvation is opened up. It's kind of like the passage where Jesus says, go out, and if people don't want to come in and have the banquet, go out to the byways and highways and find all the poor folks and the impoverished folks and bring them in, and let's have a feast with them. It's the notion of the first shall be last. It's the notion of the parable of the prodigal son. That's another metaphor of the Jewish, of the son leaving, being the Gentiles running off doing it, but the faithful law-abiding Jewish son stays, and then all of a sudden these Gentiles come back in, and the Jewish son is like, hey, I've been doing this all time. I've been doing all the stuff you told me to do, and now you're welcoming him back, and he gets the kingdom? And all of these things play into the idea that God, in the same way that Christ was the sacrificial lamb who was without blemish and sacrificed on behalf of others, Jews as a nation, as a people, as a chosen people are also a exemplification or example of Christ's sacrifice for the sake of the other. They don't necessarily realize that always, but and in the end, in 11:25, he says all Israel will be reconciled and saved. 12 through 15 deals with the sanctification of believers, and that's like the continual refinement of us. He deals with what is a transformed person. This is where you get offering your bodies as living sacrifices. This is where you get transformed by the renewing of your mind, and he gives us steps and things that he's talking, and it deals with that Gnostic world of the flesh is evil and the spirit is good. He deals with our subjective nature to authorities, our love for one another. That's the idea of Christians living in Rome. How do you live in a state that is not a Christian state? And how do you live out your life when you are called by, at the end of the day, we are held by a standard that is beyond the standard of our country, because we're held by a higher standard in that regard. And then in 14, talks about community, talks about the weaker brother, talks about some non-essentials. That's where he gets into eating and drinking. And again, that's sort of the practical side. He deals with the heavy lifting stuff, but the sanctification of the believer, he's trying to refine that and saying sanctification is not doing little things. If you eat pork, that's not going against your sanctification. If you eat pork to the weakness of your brother and become a stumbling block, that is a problem. That's the reason why, and I know the different churches do different things. I think that's one of the reasons. And although I don't really think having a sip of alcohol for an alcohol, I'm not an alcoholic, may make a difference for some, may not make a difference for the other, but that's in general why we use juice. We don't want to deprive someone of receiving the Eucharist, but we also don't want to be a stumbling block, so we choose. No, personally, I would like alcohol to, that's the fruit of the vine. Let's do it for you. But at the same time, I also recognize that we're in a day, you go back 500 years ago, they're just called drunks. You didn't have a categorization of a disease of alcoholism, and we are aware of those things now. The same reason we have gluten-free. I have those 3 crackers up there every week. No one ever eats them, so I have a little rice cracker snack after the church.
I ate them last time.
You ate them last time? Oh, that's
I
good.
did.
Oh, yeah, I didn't. They all disappeared. I didn't know where they went last time. Yeah, you were like, these are good. And then the epilogue comes along, and we'll deal with that in its own on the end, because I think it's worthwhile to look at that 15 and that chapter 16 in its own regard and how they attach and add to it. But basically, if the epilogue, it has the gospel is for both Jews and Gentiles. You have the rationale for why Paul wrote that I read to you. And then you have the 16th chapter of an add-on that just has some sort of contextual information that provides us with a little bit broader framework for the book. And that's your introduction to Romans. Done a little early. So, any questions? Save it for next time.
I'm going to,
All right.
So what are we covering next time?
Next time, we're going to cover the prologue, and we're going to get into, and I don't think the prologue will take a full hour, so I say that we're going to get into the prologue, and we'll get into, we'll probably cover most of 1 and into 2. I have to take a closer look at it. We may, and I want to revisit this now that I've sort of walked through it. There are a couple weeks that need their own weeks, like the Providence week, I think needs its own week. The epilogue, I think, needs its own week. There are a couple of themes, we'll do justification, we'll do assurance of pardon, assurance of salvation, we'll do providence. We'll theme these weeks around the theology and how Paul builds that. So next week, what I'm saying is for all of you, starting tomorrow, Thursday, read 2 chapters. Every day read 2 chapters. That'll bring you up to Wednesday reading the whole book. Thursday we'll meet again. And again, don't read just read it. You don't have to take notes. You don't have to think, just read it.
Read the whole thing at one setting.
If you want to read the whole thing in one setting and that's the way you'd rather do it, then the point is I just want you to have, after now that we've covered sort of the flow, read the introductions to your Bible. Anything you bring to the table, anything you got. The goal is that we want to be thinking about Romans for 8 weeks. It's like an immersive language course. If we just revisit something and we just look at it for 1 hour a week and we don't think about it in between, you're not going to grow from that. You'll be enlightened. Your minds will be intrigued. You may learn something or hear something that you never heard before. But if you really want to feel the transformation of this book and really have it impact to how you think about your theology, it's going to require a little bit of digging around in that.
Just
So,
keep that chair there.
yeah, keep that chair there.
Sorry.
So, yeah, that's right. So read it all at once. Many of you will probably read it Wednesday, all in one go next week. I don't really care how you read it, but the best way you can do it, would be to read it a little bit throughout and just sort of read it as your devotional reading for the day. And we're doing Thursday, and I'll remind you of that. And we'll have it announced, because I won't be here Sunday.
Do you think the Crusades